Inside Pelican Bay State Prison, California. Where the money goes in extreme isolation and control. Pelican Bay State Prison was built to disappear people, legally, quietly, and at extraordinary cost. Opened in Northern California near the Oregon border, it became one of the most expensive and controversial prisons in the United States, designed around long-term isolation, hypersecurity, and total control. This documentary examines how billions in public funds were spent to construct, operate, and defend a system that relied on solitary confinement for decades, drawing on public records, court filings, government audits, and investigative reporting. At the center is a question with no easy answer: where did the money go, and what did it buy? The prison at the end of the road. The road to Pelican Bay doesn't feel like a road to anywhere. It narrows as it cuts through redwood forest and coastal fog, winding north until California seems to thin out and dissolve. There are no cities nearby, no freeways humming in the distance. Just trees, gray sky, and a quiet that feels intentional. This is Del Norte County, remote by design, isolated by geography, and at its edge sits one of the most expensive prisons ever built by the state of California. Pelican Bay State Prison opened in 1989. On paper, it was a solution. According to state planning documents and legislative hearings, California officials were facing overcrowding, gang violence inside prisons, and a growing fear that existing facilities could not contain what they called the worst of the worst. Pelican Bay was supposed to fix that. It would be modern. It would be secure. It would be final. But what was less visible at the time, buried in budgets, construction contracts, and later court filings, was the scale of the investment. Hundreds of millions of dollars to build. Tens of millions more every year to operate. And a model of incarceration that depended not on rehabilitation or movement, but on isolation so complete that human contact itself became a controlled resource. From the beginning, Pelican Bay was different. Unlike older prisons that evolved over decades, Pelican Bay was engineered from scratch. Its most infamous section, the Security Housing Unit, known simply as the SHU, was not an add-on. It was the centerpiece. Windowless concrete cells. Remote-controlled doors. Electronic surveillance. Prisoners held alone for 22 to 23 hours a day, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. According to court records later filed in federal lawsuits, some prisoners described the SHU as a place where time stopped. No natural light. No physical contact. No group activities. Food delivered through slots in steel doors. Exercise alone, in concrete yards sometimes described as dog runs. This was not accidental. It was paid for. Construction records reviewed by journalists in the 1990s showed that Pelican Bay cost significantly more per bed than most other California prisons built in the same era. The reasons were always framed as necessities: reinforced concrete, advanced locking systems, surveillance infrastructure, staffing ratios far higher than average. Security costs money, officials argued. Control costs money. Safety costs money. But as the years passed, another story emerged, one not just about security, but about spending without oversight, about systems that perpetuated themselves because so much money was already committed to keeping them alive. Pelican Bay sits on land once owned by timber companies, far from population centers. That remoteness had financial consequences from day one. Everything had to be transported in: building materials, equipment, food, medical supplies, staff. According to state employment data, the prison quickly became one of the largest employers in Del Norte County, transforming the local economy into one deeply dependent on the facility's continued operation. This created a quiet but powerful incentive structure. When a prison becomes the economic backbone of a region, closing it or downsizing it stops being a correctional decision and starts becoming a political one. Public records from California budget committees show that by the early 1990s, Pelican Bay's annual operating costs were already drawing scrutiny. Staffing alone accounted for a massive share of the budget. The SHU required more guards per prisoner than standard housing units. Overtime expenses climbed. Hazard pay became routine. Training costs expanded to cover new security protocols and technologies. And yet, the population inside the SHU kept growing. According to Internal Department of Corrections data cited in later litigation, prisoners were often sent to the SHU not for violent acts committed inside Pelican Bay, but based on gang affiliation determinations. These determinations relied on confidential informants, symbols, drawings, or associations, criteria that civil rights groups later challenged as vague and unreliable. Every transfer into the SHU carried a price tag. More staffing hours. More security procedures. More infrastructure wear. More medical and mental health costs tied to long-term isolation. Those costs rarely appeared in headlines. Instead, Pelican Bay was marketed as a success. Official statements emphasized the absence of large-scale riots, the containment of gang leadership, the control of violence. But according to investigative reports published years later, the absence of visible chaos masked a different kind of crisis. One unfolding slowly, in budgets and courtrooms rather than cell blocks. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, lawsuits began to pile up. Prisoners challenged conditions of confinement, alleging violations of constitutional rights. Mental health professionals testified in court about the psychological impact of prolonged isolation. Judges ordered reviews. Experts were hired. Consultants were paid. All of that cost money too. State financial disclosures show that California spent millions defending Pelican Bay-related litigation over the years. Settlements, compliance measures, revised policies, additional monitoring, all funded by taxpayers. Even when the state lost or agreed to reforms, the prison itself remained open, its core infrastructure unchanged. The SHU, once hailed as cutting edge, became a liability that could not easily be dismantled. Too much had been invested. Too many jobs depended on it. Too many political careers had been built on the promise that Pelican Bay kept the public safe. And then came the hunger strikes. In 2011, prisoners inside Pelican Bay's SHU began refusing food. According to news reports and statements from prisoner representatives, the strikes were a protest against indefinite solitary confinement and the conditions inside the unit. The protests spread to other prisons across California, drawing international attention. For the first time, Pelican Bay was no longer just a line item in a state budget. It was a symbol. The response was expensive. Emergency medical monitoring. Increased staffing. Legal consultations. Public relations efforts. Legislative hearings. The state launched reviews of its gang validation and solitary confinement policies, commissioning studies and task forces. Again, the money flowed. According to state audit reports, even as reforms were discussed, Pelican Bay's operating costs remained among the highest in the system on a per-prisoner basis. Isolation was not cheap. Control was not efficient. But the system had been built around those principles, and reversing them proved far more complex than continuing to fund them. What makes Pelican Bay unique is not just how much it cost, but how those costs became normalized. Once a billion-dollar prison exists, it demands billion-dollar thinking to justify itself. Every budget cycle becomes an exercise in preservation. Every reform is filtered through the question of whether it threatens the underlying investment. Former correctional officials interviewed by journalists described Pelican Bay as a machine that could not easily slow down. Too specialized. Too remote. Too embedded in regional economics and state politics. And beneath it all were the people inside, men whose daily existence was shaped by architectural decisions and budget approvals made years before they arrived. According to court filings, some spent decades in solitary confinement without a fixed release date, their status reviewed periodically but rarely changed. Each year they remained there, the state paid again. For electricity. For food delivery systems. For medical checks conducted through steel doors. For guards stationed outside cells that rarely opened. This is where the money went, not in a single dramatic theft or scandal, but in a slow, relentless accumulation of costs justified by fear, security, and the promise of control. Pelican Bay was never just a prison. It was a financial commitment to a philosophy, that isolation could solve problems that rehabilitation could not, and that the price, whatever it turned out to be, was worth paying. In the next chapter, we will trace how that philosophy was sold, defended, and eventually challenged, inside courtrooms, legislative chambers, and the cells themselves, revealing how a system designed to contain danger ended up consuming extraordinary public resources to sustain itself. The business of isolation. By the time Pelican Bay State Prison entered its second decade, it was no longer an experiment. It was an institution. Politically defended, financially entrenched, and structurally resistant to change. What had begun as a response to fear had matured into a system with its own economic logic, one that rewarded expansion, justified permanence, and treated isolation not as an emergency measure, but as a business model. According to California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation budget records, Pelican Bay consistently ranked among the most expensive prisons in the state on a per-inmate basis. The reasons were always presented as technical. Security housing units required more staff. Remote locations demanded higher logistical costs. Specialized facilities needed specialized maintenance. Each explanation, standing alone, sounded reasonable. Together, they formed a structure where cost escalation became routine rather than exceptional. At the center of that structure was staffing. Isolation does not reduce labor. It increases it. In standard prison housing, one correctional officer might oversee dozens of inmates in shared spaces. In the SHU, movement itself became an operation. Every cell door was controlled electronically. Every escort required multiple officers. Every medical visit, shower, or exercise period triggered a chain of procedures designed to eliminate contact at all costs. According to testimony cited in later federal court filings, staffing ratios in Pelican Bay's SHU were significantly higher than in general population units. Overtime became common. Fatigue became normalized. The budget absorbed it all. Personnel costs ballooned quietly. Salaries. Benefits. Pensions. Workers' compensation claims related to stress and injury. Internal reports referenced by investigative journalists showed that security-focused prisons like Pelican Bay consumed a disproportionate share of California's correctional labor budget, even as they housed a relatively small percentage of the total prison population. Then there were the contracts. Public procurement records reveal a steady stream of private vendors tied to Pelican Bay's operation. Food services adapted to delivery through steel slots. Medical providers contracted to perform evaluations without physical contact. Technology companies supplied surveillance systems, locking mechanisms, and monitoring software designed specifically for high-security environments. Each upgrade was justified as a safety necessity. Each renewal extended the life of the system. Maintenance costs alone told a revealing story. Pelican Bay's architecture, reinforced concrete, sealed environments, electronic controls, was built to last, but also to degrade in expensive ways. When something failed, it rarely failed cheaply. A malfunctioning electronic door was not a simple repair. A cracked concrete wall in a windowless unit required specialized assessment. Ventilation systems had to function flawlessly in spaces where air circulation was tightly controlled. According to state maintenance logs cited in audit summaries, Pelican Bay required ongoing capital expenditures long after construction debts were paid. The prison aged, but it did not become cheaper. It became more expensive to preserve. Healthcare spending added another layer. Court filings and independent medical evaluations repeatedly raised concerns about the mental health effects of prolonged solitary confinement. Even when the state disputed the conclusions, it could not ignore the costs. Psychiatric consultations. Crisis interventions. Suicide prevention protocols. Emergency transports. Isolation created medical needs that standard incarceration did not. According to publicly available settlement agreements and compliance reports, California was repeatedly ordered to improve mental health care across its prison system, including Pelican Bay. That meant more clinicians, more evaluations, more documentation, more spending. Yet the structure of isolation remained largely intact. One reason was bureaucratic inertia. Another was political risk. A third was financial momentum. By the early 2000s, Pelican Bay had become a sunk cost on an enormous scale. Billions had already been spent. Closing or radically restructuring the prison would not only require new investments elsewhere. It would force the state to acknowledge that previous spending decisions had been flawed. That acknowledgement never came easily. Legislative hearings referenced in news reports often circled the same arguments. Pelican Bay housed dangerous individuals. Pelican Bay prevented violence elsewhere. Pelican Bay worked. But when lawmakers asked for data, clear evidence that long-term isolation reduced overall prison violence, the answers were often ambiguous. Studies cited by the state were contested by independent researchers. Correlation was mistaken for causation. Security was assumed rather than proven. Meanwhile, the money kept moving. Internal CDCR memoranda later obtained by journalists showed that once prisoners were classified into the SHU system, they tended to remain there for years. Reviews existed, but the criteria for release were opaque. Each continued placement justified continued funding. In effect, the SHU created a stable population that stabilized budgets. This was not a conspiracy in the traditional sense. There was no single memo ordering the system to grow. Instead, it was a convergence of incentives. Administrators were rewarded for preventing incidents, not for reducing isolation. Vendors were paid to maintain security, not to dismantle it. Rural economies depended on prison payrolls. Politicians feared being blamed for any future violence linked, fairly or not, to reform. Even resistance became expensive. When prisoners organized hunger strikes, the state responded with emergency measures. According to news coverage and official statements, medical monitoring intensified. Staff hours increased. Legal teams prepared for potential injunctions. Negotiations were conducted through layers of bureaucracy. The strikes did not shut down Pelican Bay. They increased its operating costs. And yet, something shifted. For the first time, the financial logic of isolation was challenged not just in court, but in public opinion. Investigative reports began connecting the dots between solitary confinement and spending. Headlines asked why California was paying so much to keep so few people in such extreme conditions, especially as crime rates declined statewide. Federal courts began asking harder questions too. In lawsuits that would later reshape California's use of solitary confinement, judges examined not only conditions, but justifications. According to court opinions, the state struggled to explain why indefinite isolation remained necessary for prisoners who had not committed violent acts in years, or ever. Reform became unavoidable. But reform, like everything else at Pelican Bay, came with a price tag. Policy changes required retraining staff. Reclassifying prisoners required assessments. Modifying housing units required construction. Reducing isolation did not mean reducing costs overnight. In some cases, it temporarily increased them. This was the paradox at the heart of Pelican Bay. The very system that was supposed to represent ultimate control had locked the state into a financial commitment that limited its own freedom to change. Isolation was no longer just a security strategy. It was an investment, one that demanded constant justification. And as scrutiny intensified, another uncomfortable question began to surface. If Pelican Bay was so expensive to operate, so difficult to reform, and so controversial in its outcomes, why had it been built this way in the first place? To answer that, we have to go back, not just to policy decisions, but to the political climate that made extreme spending feel not only acceptable, but necessary. In the next chapter, we will trace how fear, public pressure, and tough-on-crime politics transformed budget debates into blank checks, and how Pelican Bay became a monument not just to incarceration, but to an era of decision-making whose costs are still being paid today. The price of a promise. Pelican Bay State Prison did not emerge from a vacuum. It was born from a promise, one made repeatedly to the public during the final decades of the 20th century. That safety could be purchased, that crime could be controlled through force, and that no price was too high if it meant preventing the worst outcomes imaginable. To understand how Pelican Bay became what it is, the money has to be traced back to fear. In the late 1970s and 1980s, California, like much of the United States, was gripped by anxiety about crime. High-profile murders, prison riots, and the rise of organized prison gangs dominated headlines. According to archived news reports and legislative transcripts, politicians faced intense pressure to appear decisive. Tough on crime was not a slogan. It was a survival strategy. Budgets reflected that urgency. During this period, California dramatically expanded its prison system, authorizing dozens of new facilities in rapid succession. Pelican Bay stood out because it went further than the others. It was not just another prison. It was meant to be the final destination. The place where the state could send people it believed could not be controlled anywhere else. Internal planning documents referenced in later investigations show that Pelican Bay was designed around a worst-case scenario mindset. What if prisoners coordinated violence across institutions? What if gang leaders continued to operate from behind bars? What if existing prisons failed? The answer, officials believed, was total isolation. And isolation, engineered at scale, required unprecedented spending. Construction bids emphasized durability over flexibility. Concrete over openness. Automation over human judgment. Every design choice pushed costs upward, but each was justified by the same argument: this prison had to work, no matter the expense. Once that logic was accepted, oversight weakened. According to state audit summaries, early cost overruns at Pelican Bay were acknowledged but rarely challenged. The political risk of appearing soft outweighed concerns about fiscal restraint. Appropriations passed with limited debate. Emergency funding requests were approved quickly. The prison opened on time. The bills arrived later. As years passed, the promises attached to Pelican Bay hardened into assumptions. If violence declined somewhere else, Pelican Bay took the credit. If violence occurred, Pelican Bay was framed as the reason it hadn't been worse. This made the prison almost impossible to evaluate objectively. Financial accountability blurred into moral certainty. Court cases eventually pierced that certainty. In federal lawsuits challenging indefinite solitary confinement, judges scrutinized the state's claims. According to written opinions, the courts found that many prisoners held in the SHU posed no ongoing threat and had been isolated based on criteria that lacked transparency or due process. The rulings forced California to change course. In 2015, following a landmark settlement referenced widely in news coverage, the state agreed to significantly limit the use of long-term solitary confinement. Thousands of prisoners were released from SHU conditions statewide. Pelican Bay's role began to shift. But the infrastructure remained. The cells did not disappear. The staffing structures did not vanish overnight. The budgets did not collapse. Instead, Pelican Bay adapted. Repurposing units, revising classifications, maintaining security systems that had already been paid for and still required maintenance. Reform did not erase cost. It redistributed it. According to post-settlement budget analyses, California continued to spend heavily on Pelican Bay even as isolation decreased. Mental health services expanded. Programming increased. Oversight intensified. Compliance monitoring required new layers of administration. This revealed a final, uncomfortable truth: once a prison like Pelican Bay is built, there is no cheap version of its future. The state had purchased a solution to fear, but fear changes, and concrete does not. Today, Pelican Bay stands as a physical record of decisions made decades ago under intense political pressure. Its price tag cannot be reduced to a single number. It exists in construction costs long since paid, in annual operating budgets still debated, in settlements funded by taxpayers, and in opportunity costs, the programs, schools, and services that money did not go to. Public records do not show a single villain behind Pelican Bay's expense. There was no mastermind, no secret deal that explains it all. Instead, there was a system that rewarded certainty over reflection, control over flexibility, and immediate reassurance over long-term cost. That is where the money went. It went into walls designed to last forever. Into systems designed to eliminate risk rather than manage it. Into a promise that total control was possible if the public was willing to pay for it. Pelican Bay did not fail in the way scandals fail. It succeeded exactly as it was designed to succeed. And that may be the most expensive outcome of all. Because once a society builds something to embody its fear, dismantling it requires more than money. It requires admitting that the promise itself was flawed. And that is a cost no budget can easily absorb. When the bill never stops coming. Pelican Bay State Prison still stands at the end of that long, quiet road in Northern California. The fog still rolls in from the coast. The concrete still absorbs the cold. The doors still lock with the same mechanical certainty they were designed for decades ago. From the outside, very little has changed. But beneath the surface, something irreversible has happened. The story of Pelican Bay is not just a story about a prison. It is a story about how fear becomes policy, how policy becomes infrastructure, and how infrastructure becomes destiny. It is about what happens when a society decides that the most extreme solution is also the safest one, and then builds it in concrete, steel, and billion-dollar budgets. No single law created Pelican Bay. No single official designed its legacy. It emerged from a chain of decisions, each one justified in its moment, each one funded in the name of public safety. And once the checks were written, once the walls were poured, the question stopped being should we do this? And became how do we live with it now? That is where the money went. It went into a system designed to remove risk by removing people from human contact. Into technology meant to replace judgment. Into staffing models that treated isolation as routine. Into legal defenses, audits, settlements, reforms, and revisions. Each one layered on top of the last, each one adding cost without ever fully undoing what came before. Pelican Bay teaches a quiet lesson about power. Not the power to punish, but the power to commit. Once a government commits to a solution at this scale, walking it back becomes politically dangerous, economically disruptive, and psychologically difficult. Admitting a mistake is expensive. Maintaining the status quo is easier, until it isn't. The men who lived inside those cells paid one price. Taxpayers paid another. Entire communities reorganized their economies around the prison's existence. Careers were built defending it. Budgets were written assuming it would always be there. And yet, even after reforms, even after court rulings, even after public scrutiny, the bill never stopped coming. That is the final truth of Pelican Bay. Extreme systems do not end cleanly. They fade slowly, absorbing more resources as they are dismantled than they ever did while expanding. They leave behind structures that must still be staffed, maintained, justified, and explained. The prison was built to control danger. What it ultimately revealed was something else entirely, that fear is one of the most expensive forces a society can invest in. Because fear does not depreciate. Concrete does not forget. And once billions are spent to solve a problem one way, every alternative becomes harder to imagine. Pelican Bay is not an outlier. It is a warning written in reinforced walls and budget line items. A reminder that when we ask where the money goes, we are really asking what we value, what we fear, and how much we are willing to pay to feel safe. And the most unsettling answer of all may be this. We paid for certainty in an uncertain world. And discovered that certainty was the one thing money could never buy. This story is a dramatized adaptation inspired by real events. Some names, places, and details have been changed for privacy.